Welcome to the JMC True Crime channel. Thank you so much for joining me. Today's case is all about a man capable of absolute depravity, and yet he escapes the title of serial killer based on a technicality. Yup, you heard me right. To learn what that technicality was, strap in and let's get stuck in. Back in the 1980s, Jimmy Randall, or James Michael Randall, was seemingly a simple man. He was a husband and a father. He worked hard and he played hard too. He lived in Boston, Massachusetts, and in 1984 he became the chief suspect in the disappearance of Holly Jean Coate. Holly was 28 years old at the time of her disappearance. She'd been married for 11 years, and she had a 6-year-old daughter. She also worked at a bar called Mahaki in Gardner, Massachusetts, and on the 4th of March of that same year, she ended her shift at the Mahaki and went with a group of friends to another bar called Mr. D's Lounge. This lounge stayed open for longer hours compared to the Mahaki. This was also the very last time that Holly was ever seen alive. She had arranged to meet some more of her friends at their house for a nightcap, but she never showed up. Holly drove a 1969 Pontiac Tempest, quite a nice and sleek car, if you ask me, and the very next morning, the car was still sitting in the parking lot of Mr. D's Lounge. This sent alarm bells ringing. Why didn't she show up? Where did she go? What happened to her? These are the very questions that Holly's husband and Holly's friends were left wondering. The state police were soon notified, and an extensive search began. Holly's family and friends, they posted a $6,000 reward, and her husband Joseph even took a month off of work to try and find her. Sadly, 3 months would pass, with absolutely no results, no sign of her, no leads, nothing. It was as if she had just vanished. That was until roughly 3 months later, in early May of 1984, things changed. So much time had passed with no inclination as to what had happened to her, until this fateful day, when some, and I do mean some, questions were answered. A couple had been out canoeing in an area close to the Birch Hill Dam, which was about 15 miles from Gardner. Whilst canoeing, they had noticed that something had floated out of the water and got entangled in some birch trees, so they paddled closer. As they approached, they quickly realized just what it was that they were seeing, and they were seeing Holly Coates' nude and very decomposed body. Her arms had been tied together by a purple sock, so at this stage we wouldn't know exactly what had happened to her, just would know that she had suffered. And upon completing her autopsy, the coroner confirmed that she had died due to strangulation. You see, James was married at this time to his wife Linda. They shared 2 children who were only 3 years apart, and James and Linda were part of the same social circle as Holly. Linda and Holly were actually best friends. As a matter of fact, the very night that James and Linda met was the same night that James and Holly met. When Holly and her husband sometimes needed a babysitter, it was Linda and James that would get the call. They were very familiar with one another, and it was this familiarity that led to suspicion being cast upon James. James had actually been part of the social group that had been hanging out with Holly 3 months prior at Mr. D's Lounge, and that meant he was one of the very last people to have seen her alive. That wasn't the only reason why James was considered suspicious. Holly's body was found in an area extremely close to one of James's favourite fishing holes, but because so much time had passed and Holly's body had decomposed to a point where there was little physical evidence to retain, There wasn't really a crime scene to analyse. The police did question James, hoping that he would let something incriminating slip, but he didn't. And so, with no real evidence, the police let him go. 2 years would pass before the police were able to obtain incriminating evidence of James's cruel nature. However, it was from a completely separate incident, and this time the testimony came from his own wife, Linda. Linda later testified that he came home at 2 a.m. in the morning, closed their bedroom window, demanded sex, and started choking her. He tied her up and then forced himself on her. James was soon arrested for this assault and sentenced to 5 to 7 years in state prison for it. During his time in prison, as he was conversing with a psychologist, he revealed that as a child he witnessed his father choking his mother up against the kitchen counter, and per his own admission, this sparked a curiosity within him. So he began to experiment. He began choking women during intercourse, later including his wife, as this was an act of him asserting control. Now, it's extremely possible and likely that this was not consensual. And, if it was, great, you do you. But just based on the little amount of information I've given you already about James, well, you can form your own assessment. I certainly have. James would spend 5 years behind bars and be released in 1992, and during his imprisonment, his wife Linda divorced him. Upon his release, he was supposed to report to a probation officer to report where he was living and what he was doing for work, but he didn't do this. Instead, he fled the state. He fled to South Florida. In Florida, he got a job as a window installer, and if you're wondering how he managed to do this and it not flag up, I'm afraid I don't have the answer. Sorry. Anywho, as the years went by, he seemed to live an ordinary life. Seemed being the operative word here, because on the 20th of October 1995, again, things changed. Or maybe this was the status quo the whole time. It was on the 20th of October when Wendy Evans, a suspected sex worker, was found. She had been killed in the exact same manner as Holly Jean Coate, so by strangulation, and her body was found nude. However, unlike Holly Jean Coate, her body hadn't begun to decompose because the day she was found was also the day that she had been killed. Wendy was 42 years old at the time of her murder. She had been killed elsewhere, and then her body was dumped on Myrtle Lane in Oldsmar. She was found by a pizza delivery driver. I do want to note that Wendy's family insist that she wasn't a prostitute. They, of course, can note that she did have a criminal record for burglary and armed robbery, but that she was not a prostitute. Ultimately, this doesn't matter when it comes to determining her value as a person. Wendy was a person, so she immediately had value. However, it does matter in that it could help with building a profile for her killer. After discovering Wendy's body, it was clear to see that she had been savagely beaten and, of course, choked to death in this instance. One can infer that Wendy's killer is someone that thrived on control, someone that liked to choke. And who is it that I've mentioned so far that likes to choke women? Only 3 months would pass before another body was found, and this time it was the body of 27-year-old Cynthia Pugh. On the 18th of January 1996, a construction worker discovered her nude body. It was very clear to see that she had been beaten and, just like the women before her, had been choked to death. Cynthia was very young at the time of her death. She had separated from her husband, and the two shared a 4-year-old son. Cynthia's husband retained full custody, but Cynthia did have a plan. She would tell her parents that she wanted to go and get the equivalent of a high school degree, and then go to school to become a beautician, and then file for custody of her son. She wanted to get her life together. Sadly, Cynthia did have a proclivity for drugs, and that derailed her in many ways. She was known to have been busted by the police for prostituting herself to make the money to pay for the drugs, and so this is another victim that was also suspected to be a prostitute. You'll see a pattern forming here. Cynthia's body was found just by a trash bin outside of a Costco building, and when the police showed up to examine the area, that wasn't the only thing they found. They found some tire marks that belonged to a Dodge D50 pickup. Who drove a Dodge D50 pickup? You know. Come on, you know. But the police didn't know. Not quite yet, that is. You see, the pattern that was left from the tyre tracks was that of a Firestone Radial ATX, and these specific tyres were typically only used on small trucks and SUVs. And this type of tyre had only been on the market for 6 months, and that meant that only few had purchased them. That helped to narrow the field. The police checked in with the local Firestone franchise and discovered that only one set of that type of tyre had been sold in the entire county during the 6 months that it had been available. And as you can imagine, that was extremely helpful. They were able to trace the tyres back to a 1985 Dodge pickup truck, and this truck was owned by a motel clerk named Terry Jo Howard. Terry Jo was also a suspected prostitute, and she lived in an apartment. Though she didn't live in it alone, detectives began to watch her apartment and noticed a man driving the truck. This man lived with Terry Jo, and he had a shaved head and a mustache. A very distinctive look, if you will. These tyre tracks weren't just found by Cynthia Pugh's body, they were also found by Wendy Evans, and so, as you can imagine, this was doubly incriminating, and the police wanted to get it right. So, to be absolutely certain, they persuaded the Firestone dealership to call Terry Jo and claim that the tyres had been recalled. They advised her to bring the truck in for a free set of replacements, and thankfully she did. When she brought the truck in and the tyres were taken off, the detectives grabbed them. And upon examining the tyres, this validated their suspicion. In fact, it damn near confirmed it, that this truck had been to both crime scenes. As much as this new evidence gave them a lead to follow, it wasn't quite enough. They still needed more for an arrest. The police did begin to follow Terry Jo and the man she was living with. They learnt a few things from scoping out her apartment. Some seemingly innocuous things were that they loved to visit fast food restaurants and rent videos. But inarguably, the biggest thing they learnt was the name of the man that Terry Jo lived with. She lived with 42-year-old ex-con James Randall. They delved into his background, and that's where they learnt about the choking of his ex-wife, his possible involvement in the death of Holly Jean Coates, and his sexual desires that he had confessed to his psychiatrist whilst he had been behind bars. All of this gave them a fairly good idea of whom they were about to be dealing with. Enough time had passed, and the detectives decided they wanted to speak to this guy, eye to eye. So they conveniently chose a time when they knew that Terry Jo wouldn't be there, and they knocked on the door. They requested to speak to Terry Jo, already knowing that she wasn't at the property, and when James advised them of this, they just said they'd speak to him instead. They showed him pictures of the victims and asked if he knew anything, and James played it cool. He said that he'd never met them, they'd never been in the apartment or in the truck, nothing. Now, don't forget, the police did have the upper hand here. They knew his history, and they knew that there was a warrant outstanding for his arrest, given that he had fled from Massachusetts years prior. So they really could have arrested him right then and there, but they chose not to. They weren't quite ready yet. They thanked him and they left the apartment. What they wanted to do next was seize the truck. Now, the best way to do that without needing to get a search warrant was to arrest James after he had gotten behind the wheel. This would give them probable cause and validate their need to search the truck. So that was the plan. This plan did not go as intended. A few minutes after the detectives had left the apartment, James was getting ready to drive to work, and he spotted some blue lights behind him. And he knew what that meant. He knew that the police wanted to pull him over. However, James wasn't alone as he was driving. He was actually giving a ride to one of his co-workers named Maitland. And James just turned to Maitland and he said, "I can't do it. I can't stop. I can't do it." And Maitland, all confused, he says, "What do you mean? What do you mean you can't stop? What's going on?" And James, in his panic, knowing that his actions were catching up to him, he continued to drive. Recklessly. Haphazardly, James drove through a cul-de-sac and pushed Maitland out of the car. The police stopped to check on Maitland, and this gave James more of a head start. James had enough time to abandon the truck and to duck into the woods. The police, even though they brought in dogs and a helicopter, they couldn't find him. But what they didn't know is that he was lying in a ditch, covered in mud, camouflaged. The perfect cover. For the next 4 days, he eluded a massive manhunt. He slept during the day and he moved at night. Like an owl, really. On the 1st of July, 1996, he was finally detained. Finally! When James's trial eventually began, Terry Jo was one of the star witnesses. Despite how unhealthy their relationship was, Terry Jo clearly had an affinity for... I hesitate to say her boyfriend, I'm more inclined to say her abuser, because that's what he was. Terry Jo made it clear that James was special to her. She believed that he was the only man that had ever cared for her and helped to free her from a life of drugs and prostitution. In court, she was asked why she allowed James to choke her during sex, and her answer did take some people by surprise. Her answer was this: "I didn't want him to not get what he needed and then kill me 2 years down the road. I wanted him to have control over it." Those were Terry Jo's words, and we already know just how important control was to James. But once Terry Jo stopped showing fear, James lost interest. He stopped choking her. Fear is what he thrived on. In April of 1997, James was convicted of first-degree murder in the deaths of both Wendy Evans and Cynthia Pugh. Sadly, there was not enough evidence to convict him for Holly Jean Coates' murder as well. There were 3 aggravating factors that led to James's sentencing. The first being that he had a previous conviction for a felony. You'll remember what he did to his ex-wife Linda. Also, that previous conviction was a violent felony. And the murders that he committed were especially heinous, callous, or cruel. With these factors in mind, James was sentenced to 2 death sentences and a concurrent charge of 5 years for evading the police. Judge Schaefer, the very one that handed down the 2 death sentences, listed her reasons for doing so. One reason was due to the cruelty of his method when he murdered these 2 women. She said he tortured these 2 women. He put his hands around their necks and squeezed. He got sexually aroused as he watched their eyes fill with terror and horror, knowing that they were going to die. Now, the defense had argued that James didn't have murderous intent, But that wasn't really tenable given that he had killed more than once. That didn't stop James from appealing the convictions, though. 3 years later, in 2000, his appeal was heard by the Supreme Court of Florida. The court upheld this appeal, stating that they didn't believe he choked these two women to kill them only for sexual pleasure. And with this, his first-degree murder charges were reduced to second-degree, and his death sentences were changed to life imprisonment. He is currently being held in Perry, Florida. The reason why the Supreme Court had upheld his appeal? Well, his ex-girlfriend Terry Jo and his ex-wife Linda had also sustained the choking during sex, and they lived to tell the tale. That was the justification, that James had choked other women and they had lived, so they believed it reasonable to infer that he didn't mean to kill his sexual partners, he just accidentally did. You'll have to make your own determination from that. That means that legally, James isn't a serial killer. Instead, he's just an accident-prone serial sexual partner. Wow. As always, big thank you to each and every single one of you that has made it to this point in the video. I'm always extremely grateful. Do make sure you are liking, sharing, commenting, and subscribing. Hit that subscribe bell. It won't be long until we're back at you with more content, so I'll catch you then. Bye.